The sea around the Outer Hebrides does not feel like the sea most people imagine. It isn't bright and open and generous. It is heavy, gray, and quietly hostile, an enormous moving surface that never promises you anything. In winter, it becomes something even more severe, a cold presence that seems to swallow sound. The wind is constant. The sky sits low. The islands look as if they've been worn down by centuries of being watched by storms. And out beyond those islands, farther than most people ever bother to picture, there is a small cluster of rocks called the Flannan Isles. They are not the kind of place you visit. They're the kind of place you pass at a distance with relief. The largest of them, Eilean Mor, is little more than a blunt rise from the Atlantic. Grass clings to it in stubborn patches. Birds nest where they can. The rest is rock and slope, and the endless sound of water breaking and retreating. There are no villages, no roads, no people. Only the feeling that if you stood there long enough, you would begin to understand what isolation really means. At the turn of the 20th century, a lighthouse stood on that island. It was not built for beauty. It was built for survival, for ships that needed a fixed point of light in a part of the world where darkness and weather could turn a routine voyage into a death sentence. The lighthouse was modern for its time, a hard-edged structure with thick walls and a lantern room at the top that could cut through fog and rain with disciplined consistency. The job of keeping that light burning belonged to 3 men at a time. They lived there in shifts. Weeks on the rock, weeks back on the mainland. They worked, ate, slept, and watched the sea. They kept records. They maintained machinery. They tended the lamps and the fuel. They were the kind of men who did not get to be careless, because carelessness at sea doesn't always punish you immediately. Sometimes it waits until you're certain you are safe. In December of 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers were stationed on Eilean Mor. Their names were Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur. They were not boys. They were not inexperienced. They were men chosen because the Northern Lighthouse Board believed they could handle what the island demanded. Solitude, routine, and the slow psychological pressure of being surrounded by nothing but ocean and weather. On the mainland, life moved forward. People worked, traveled, celebrated the coming of a new year. In ports and villages, the lighthouse was not something anyone thought about often. A light that works is invisible in the mind. It becomes part of the world's background, like gravity. But in late December, something changed. Ships passing through the area began to report that the light on Eilean Mor was not behaving normally. On some nights it was not visible. On others, it seemed dim or absent entirely. At first, these reports were treated cautiously. Weather can obscure light. Fog can bend it. Storms can swallow it. It would not be the first time a lighthouse seemed to vanish when in reality it was shining faithfully behind a curtain of rain. Still, the reports continued. The Lighthouse Board scheduled a relief vessel to visit the island and rotate the men, deliver supplies, and confirm everything was operating as it should. The ship assigned to the task was the Hesperus, and aboard it was a man named Joseph Moore, a relief keeper whose job was to step in when the station men were rotated out. On December 26, 1900, the Hesperus approached the Flannan Isles. The sea was unsettled. The air had that sharp winter clarity that comes with cold wind and distant rain. As the ship drew close, Moore did what anyone in his position would do. He looked toward the lighthouse, expecting to see movement, a figure, some sign of life. It was customary for keepers to acknowledge an approaching vessel. Flags might be raised, a lantern waved. At the very least, a man would appear outside to watch. But as the Hesperus neared Eilean Mor, nothing moved. No figures on the rocks, No one waiting near the landing. No signal. Only the lighthouse itself, standing upright against the sky, looking strangely neutral, as if it did not care who was coming or why. Moore felt the first cold edge of concern before he even stepped on a land. When the ship anchored, they waited for the keepers to come out. They did not. Moore volunteered to go ashore. The landing on Eilean Moor was difficult even in good conditions. Waves slapped the rocks. The boat rose and dropped with the swell. When Moore finally stepped onto the island, the wind hit him hard, and the smell of salt and wet stone filled his lungs. He began walking up the path toward the lighthouse. As he climbed, the silence grew heavier. Not the pleasant silence of solitude, but the kind that suggests something missing. He called out. His voice was taken by the wind. He called again, louder, expecting at any moment to hear an answer. Nothing. When he reached the lighthouse buildings, the first detail that struck him was how ordinary everything looked. The structure was intact. Doors were closed. Windows unbroken. There was no sign of damage. No obvious disaster. No smoke. No fire. He knocked. No response. He tried the door. It was unlocked. And when he stepped inside, the air was stale and still, the way it is in a room that should be lived in but isn't. He moved through the kitchen, the living quarters, the storage areas, calling each man's name. Marshall, Duckett, MacArthur. No one answered. The beds were unmade. A meal appeared to have been interrupted, depending on which account you read. Signs of haste were there in small, unsettling ways. A chair slightly moved. Items not put away. Routine disrupted. But the strongest detail was this. The lighthouse mechanism, the very heart of their duty, was not in the state it should have been. The lamp had been tended, but not with the precision you would expect from men who understood that ships depended on them. The logbooks were present, yet the house felt abandoned rather than rotated, as if the men had stepped out briefly and never returned. Moore searched everywhere. He looked in every room, every corner, every place a man might collapse if injured. He went back outside and scanned the island, shouting into the wind until his throat hurt. He looked down toward the landing and the rocks below, imagining a slip, a fall, an accident. But there were no bodies, no sign of a struggle, no footprints that led to an answer. Only the Atlantic, moving in its endless repetition, offering nothing back. By the time Moore returned to the Hesperus to report what he had found, the story had already taken on a shape that would never leave it. 3 men had vanished from a lighthouse on a rock in the ocean, a place built to be watched, a place designed to prevent disappearance. And yet, disappearance was exactly what it now contained. In the days that followed, official investigations would begin and theories would multiply. Storm waves, accidents, madness, even violence. Each explanation would try to restore logic to what felt, at its core, illogical. That 3 trained keepers would abandon their post together, leaving behind the light, the machinery, and the safety of walls, and step into the winter sea. Because the most unsettling part is not that something went wrong on Eilean Moor. It's that whatever went wrong, it was strong enough to pull all 3 men away at the same time. And once they left the lighthouse, the island became what it truly is in winter. A place where the ocean does not give back what it takes. To understand why the disappearance of the Flannan Isles keepers unsettled people so deeply, it helps to understand who these men were before they vanished and what kind of work they were trusted to do. Lighthouses at the turn of the 20th century were not symbolic posts. They were infrastructure. They were treated with seriousness because failure was measured in wrecked ships and lost lives. Thomas Marshall was the senior keeper. He was steady, methodical, and known for maintaining strict routine. He had served in multiple lighthouse postings and was regarded as dependable rather than remarkable, which in that profession was the highest compliment. He believed in doing things the right way, in keeping records accurately, and in making sure the light burned regardless of weather or mood. James Duckett was the principal keeper, second in command. He had spent many years with the Northern Lighthouse Board and was accustomed to isolation. He was married, with children on the mainland, and like many men in his position, he divided his life cleanly between duty and home. On the island, he was a keeper. Off it, he was a father and husband. The separation was understood and accepted. Donald MacArthur was the occasional keeper, brought in to assist and rotate. He was physically strong and capable, but known to be more volatile than the others. Some accounts describe him as temperamental, prone to mood swings. Others describe him as simply intense, the kind of man who took work personally and reacted strongly to stress. Whatever the truth, he had served in difficult conditions before and had not been dismissed or disciplined in a way that suggested instability. These were not men unaccustomed to hardship. They knew storms. They knew exhaustion. They knew loneliness. The Northern Lighthouse Board did not assign keepers casually. Each post came with an understanding of risk, and Eilean Moor was considered one of the harsher ones. The island was uninhabited, exposed, and difficult to land on even in good weather. Supplies arrived only on schedule. There was no quick rescue if something went wrong. Routine was what kept order. Each day followed a pattern. Lamps were cleaned and trimmed. Fuel levels were checked. Weather conditions were logged. The light was inspected repeatedly, especially during winter nights when visibility mattered most. Meals were prepared communally. The men slept in shifts, aware that the ocean never truly rested. The lighthouse itself was solid but not comfortable. Thick stone walls protected against wind but trapped cold. Narrow rooms concentrated sound. When storms hit, the building shuddered, not violently, but persistently, as if reminding its occupants that it was only a temporary structure in a much older environment. Outside, the island offered little relief. There were paths worn into the rock by repeated footsteps, but no shelter beyond the lighthouse buildings. The cliffs dropped steeply into the sea. Waves struck the rock with a force that could be felt through the ground. In winter, spray froze on contact, turning surfaces slick and dangerous. And yet, none of this was new to the keepers. What makes the events of December 1900 difficult to interpret is that nothing about the situation was unprecedented. Storms had come before. Rough seas were expected. Isolation was part of the job description. The men had not been sent unprepared into unknown conditions. The logbooks recovered from the lighthouse suggest routine until the final entries. Weather was recorded. Maintenance tasks were noted. There was no escalating language, no indication of sudden crisis. Even entries that referenced storms did so in a matter-of-fact tone, the way professionals acknowledge difficulty without dramatizing it. This absence of alarm is important. If fear was present, it was not recorded. If conflict existed, it left no trace. What the records show is continuity until continuity ends. When investigators later examined the lighthouse, they found signs that something had interrupted routine rather than destroyed it. The kitchen was not wrecked. The living quarters were not ransacked. Personal belongings remained. Clothing was still there. The men had not packed or prepared to leave permanently. Most striking was the state of the lighthouse equipment. Some details suggested it had been left unattended longer than acceptable, yet not abandoned in chaos. This contradiction became one of the central tensions of the case. order without supervision, presence without people. Outside the lighthouse, further details deepened the mystery. Certain safety features appeared disturbed. A railing near one of the landing areas was damaged. Boxes used for securing equipment were displaced. These details suggested activity near the edge of the island, close to the sea. But again, no bodies were found. No remains washed ashore. No clothing surfaced. No tools or equipment were recovered from the water. The ocean kept whatever it took. Investigators were left to reconstruct events without witnesses, relying on environment, routine, and probability. They had to imagine what could compel three men, trained to respect danger, to leave the relative safety of stone walls and climb down toward a winter sea. One possibility raised early was that a storm wave had swept them away. Waves around Eilean Mor are powerful and unpredictable, especially during winter gales. A single man caught too close to the edge could be lost instantly. But this explanation struggles with scale. It explains one disappearance easily. Two, perhaps. Three at once requires coordination or coincidence that feels forced. Another possibility was that one man had gone out and the others followed to assist, a chain of decisions driven by duty and loyalty. This aligns more closely with the psychology of lighthouse work, where no one operates alone during dangerous conditions. But again, the absence of physical evidence makes confirmation impossible. What remains consistent across all interpretations is that something drew the men away from the lighthouse together or in rapid succession. Whatever happened did not allow for retreat. It did not leave time for hesitation or reconsideration. By the time the Hesperus departed Eilean Mor after Mor's discovery, the lighthouse light had been restored, the machinery tended once more by replacement keepers. The system resumed its function quickly, as systems tend to do. Ships passed. The sea continued its cycles. The rock remained, but the absence stayed. The disappearance of Marshall, Duckett, and MacArthur did not feel like a single event. It felt like a rupture, a sudden hole torn in the expectation that competence and routine were enough to guarantee safety. That expectation would never fully recover. In the weeks and months that followed, explanations would harden into theories and theories into stories. Each retelling would emphasize different details, searching for meaning where certainty was no longer possible. And yet, at the center of all of it remained the same quiet image. A lighthouse built to be watched, still standing. A light designed to guide others, left without those who tended it. And an island that had offered no explanation, only silence, to those who came looking. When the initial shock of the discovery subsided, the task facing authorities was an uncomfortable one. There were no bodies to examine, no eyewitnesses to question, and no single moment to point to as the beginning of the tragedy. Everything that could be known had to be inferred from objects, habits, and absence. The Northern Lighthouse Board took charge of the inquiry. This was not a criminal investigation in the modern sense. It was an administrative one, concerned primarily with determining whether negligence, misconduct, or failure of duty had occurred. The question was not who had killed the men, but whether the system that placed them there had failed. Joseph Moore was questioned extensively. He described the island as he found it, orderly, intact, and deeply unsettling in its quietness. He noted the state of the lighthouse, the interrupted routines, the lack of any sign that the men had prepared to leave permanently. His testimony established the baseline from which all later explanations would grow. Inspectors examined the damage outside the lighthouse more carefully. The displaced boxes, the bent railing, the signs of recent activity near the western landing suggested that the men had been working outdoors in dangerous conditions. This was not unusual in itself. Equipment had to be secured during storms. Ropes had to be checked. Cranes and landing areas required constant attention. But the weather records added complexity. Meteorological logs from nearby locations confirmed that severe storms had passed through the area in the days before the disappearance. High winds, heavy seas, and poor visibility were all documented. These were not extraordinary by winter standards, but they were dangerous enough to require caution. The official conclusion leaned toward accident. The prevailing explanation was that one or more of the men had been swept into the sea while performing duties near the edge of the island, and that the others, attempting rescue, had followed. This explanation fit the evidence available. It accounted for the absence of bodies, the disturbed equipment, and a lack of any sign of internal conflict. It was also the explanation that allowed the system to remain intact. An accident implies tragedy without fault. It preserves the idea that the lighthouse service functioned as intended, even when outcomes were fatal. For an institution responsible for dozens of isolated posts across treacherous coastlines, this distinction mattered. The case was officially closed. But closure on paper does not always translate to closure in the mind. Almost immediately, doubts surfaced, not among officials, but among the public. Newspapers began to ask questions that reports did not answer. Why were all three men outside at once? Why was MacArthur, known to dislike storms, reportedly out in the worst conditions? Why had no distress signal been sent? Why were certain logbook entries described as strange or emotional by later writers? Some of these questions were based on fact. Others emerged from retellings that blurred accuracy with imagination. Over time, small uncertainties grew into narrative gaps, and narrative gaps invited speculation. One often quoted detail involved logbook entries allegedly describing unusual fear or agitation in the days before the disappearance. In some versions, the men were said to have written about winds so strong they were afraid, or storms that made them pray. These entries appeared dramatic, ominous, and deeply compelling. They were also almost certainly embellished. Later reviews of the original log suggest that these emotional passages were either misinterpreted or introduced through secondary accounts rather than primary documentation. Routine descriptions of weather were transformed into signs of dread by writers searching for foreshadowing. This process, the slow transformation of record into legend, is critical to understanding why the Flannan Isles case still unsettles people. The truth, as preserved in official documents, is sparse. It resists drama. It offers no single moment of collapse, no trace of panic. The legend, by contrast, supplies what the record does not: emotion, tension, narrative arc. And once legend takes hold, it rarely lets go. As the years passed, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse continued to operate. New keepers were assigned. The light burned as reliably as ever. None of the men who followed reported anything unusual. No voices, no apparitions, no sense of dread beyond the natural severity of the environment. The island itself did not change. What changed was the way people spoke about it. The disappearance of the three keepers began to circulate as a story rather than an incident. Poems were written. Articles retold the events with increasing flourish. Each version emphasized mystery over mundanity, silence over procedure. And yet, beneath every retelling, the same uncomfortable facts remained. Three experienced men vanished from a place designed to be controlled. They did not leave notes. They did not signal distress. They did not return. The official explanation satisfied administrative necessity, but did not satisfy human curiosity. It explained how the men might have been lost, but not why events unfolded in the way they did. Why all three? Why at once? Why without leaving any trace behind? These questions lingered unanswered long after the paperwork was filed away. And so the Flannan Isles Lighthouse became something more than a navigational aid. It became a symbol of the limits of explanation, a reminder that even in places built for order, uncertainty can take hold quietly and without warning. Once the official explanation had been recorded and the lighthouse returned to service, the disappearance of the Flannan Isles keepers might have faded quietly into maritime records. Accidents at sea were not rare. Men were lost every year to waves, storms, and misjudgment. What made this case different was not the loss itself, but the shape it took in memory. The explanation of a wave sweeping the men into the sea is simple. It is also plausible. Anyone who has stood near a winter coastline knows how suddenly water can rise and strike. Waves do not announce themselves. They do not give time for correction. A single misstep, a moment of distraction, can be enough. But simple explanations often leave residue. People struggle with the idea that three men, all aware of the danger, would be exposed at the same time. Lighthouse protocol emphasized safety. Men were not supposed to work near the edge alone during storms, but they were also not meant to risk all lives at once. The system assumed redundancy, that someone would remain inside, watching, able to respond. The disappearance violated that assumption. One theory proposed that a series of events unfolded rapidly. Perhaps one man went out to secure equipment. Perhaps he slipped or was struck by a wave. The others, hearing or seeing distress, rushed to assist. In the chaos of wind and spray, all were lost in quick succession. This explanation aligns with human instinct. People trained for danger are still people. They respond to cries, to movement, to urgency. Training does not erase loyalty, yet the theory rests on a sequence no one witnessed. Another idea suggested that the men had been conducting routine maintenance together, possibly moving heavy equipment or securing supply crates near the landing area. In this scenario, they were not recklessly exposed, but performing necessary work during a lull between storms. A sudden surge of water, stronger than anticipated, could have overwhelmed them. Again, this fits the environment. What complicates matters is the lack of physical evidence. No broken tools were found. No ropes torn away in a way that confirmed struggle. No marks that could be read definitively as the last trace of human effort. The ocean, once more, kept its silence. As decades passed, explanations grew more imaginative. Some writers focused on Donald MacArthur's temperament, portraying him as unstable or fearful. In certain retellings, he became the catalyst, a man driven to panic by storms, who convinced the others to abandon their post. These portrayals often cited supposed logbook entries describing fear and prayer. But careful review of the records suggests these dramatic entries were either exaggerated or misattributed. There is no clear evidence that MacArthur experienced a breakdown, nor that he persuaded the others to leave voluntarily. The idea persists because it introduces psychology where evidence is thin. Other interpretations leaned toward structural failure. Perhaps the lighthouse itself had been compromised. Perhaps the men feared collapse, but inspections found no indication that the building was in danger. The lighthouse stood firm before and after the event. Still others reached for the supernatural. In remote places, absence invites imagination. The Flannan Isles were already considered bleak, isolated, almost otherworldly. Folklore attached itself easily. Stories of voices, omens, and curses circulated in later years, despite having no connection to contemporary accounts. These stories reveal less about what happened on Eilean Moor and more about how humans process uncertainty. When a mystery lacks a visible cause, people often supply meaning in the form of forces larger than themselves. Yet the most unsettling aspect of the Flannan Isles case is how ordinary the likely explanation remains. No monsters, no madness, no conspiracy, just environment, routine, and a moment when conditions shifted faster than judgment could keep pace. And still, the discomfort remains. Because accidents usually leave traces. They leave something behind, a body, debris, a mark. Here, there was only absence, complete and uncorrected by time. Even today, when modern safety standards, surveillance, and communication have transformed maritime work, the case resonates. It reminds us that isolation amplifies risk not by adding danger, but by removing backup. There is no second opinion on a rock in the Atlantic. No confirmation from another team. Decisions are final the moment they are made. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse did not fail. The men did not necessarily fail. What failed was predictability, and that failure cannot be repaired by explanation alone. As years turned into decades, the story settled into its current form, not as a puzzle waiting for a final piece, but as a quiet question that remains open because the conditions that created it still exist. There are still remote places. There are still jobs that demand presence in hostile environments. There are still moments when judgment must be exercised without certainty. The lighthouse still stands. The light still turns. Ships still pass. And somewhere beneath that continuity lies the memory of three men who did what they were trained to do until training was no longer enough. That is why the story endures. Not because it promises revelation, but because it ends where explanation runs out and only environment remains. When the light on Eilean Moor was relit and the island returned to its routine, nothing outwardly marked what had been lost. The machinery worked. The walls held. The sea continued its cycles as it always had. From a distance, it would have looked as though nothing had changed at all. But absence has its own weight. The Flannan Isles keepers did not vanish in a moment of spectacle. There was no final signal, no message meant to be remembered. Whatever happened unfolded quietly, in the space between duty and danger, where decisions are made without witnesses and outcomes are known only after it is too late. The lighthouse remains, not as a monument, but as a function, doing what it was built to do, indifferent to the story attached to it. Ships still pass. The beam still turns. The light still cuts through darkness without asking who last tended it. Perhaps that is what makes the disappearance so unsettling. Not that something extraordinary occurred, but that something ordinary may have gone wrong in a place where error is unforgiving. That experience and preparation were present, and still not enough. That the difference between safety and loss may have been measured in seconds, or in a single step taken too close to the edge. The island does not explain itself. It never has, and does not need to. Some mysteries endure not because they are unsolvable, but because they are incomplete in a way that mirrors life itself. We're not always granted perspective. We do not always see the full shape of our choices. Sometimes the record simply stops. So as the night settles and the sound of the sea fades into distance, the story of the Flannan Isles does not ask to be solved. It asks only to be remembered, not as a legend, but as a quiet reminder of how easily certainty can give way to silence. And in that silence, the light continues to turn. This was the story of the lighthouse keepers of the Flannan Isles. If you enjoyed the experience, feel free to check out more similar stories right here on this channel. Until then, I wish you a warm and peaceful good night.